nice to have a variety. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining this Kronos Hub webinar. We want to talk about affordable access and open access publishing. So in some ways talk about the equity behind access and problems for people that struggle between institutions, different countries with accessing content, still paywalled content, but also then issues related to open access publishing and what that means for authors from different backgrounds with different funding from different countries, and trying to look at the two parts of it. So I've got our three great speakers here that are joining me. I've got Varun, who is a researcher, Sarah Ruhi, Director of Strategic Partnerships at PLOS, and Cameron Cadran, the founder and CEO at Knology and Zendy, who are joining me today in this webinar. In terms of the structure of the webinar, we'll do a very short round of instructions from everyone. And then the first part we want to focus on first on issues around accessing content. And then we'll have Cameron talk a little bit about the Zendy solution in terms of addressing that. Then we'll move on to talk about issues around affordability when it comes to publishing open access. And then we'll have Sarah from PLOS present around how PLOS addresses that and still remaining issues in terms of solving that, and then finish with a discussion. If you have any questions at any point, please pop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll bring them in either during the webinar or at the end during the Q&A. So my name's Romy Beard. I'm the Publisher Relations and Business Development Manager at Kronos Hub. So I've been leading these webinars to really try and get different people together to talk about different topics, and also work on the publisher relations side for the Kronos Hub Open Access Management platform. In terms of introduction, can I hand it over to Sarah, please?
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, wherever you are. I am Sarah Ruhi. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at PLOS, and I'm outside of Washington, D.C.
Cameron.
The usual unmuting. Yeah, my name is Cameron Cardan. I'm the founder and CEO of Knology, who are behind Zendy, and I'm connecting to you from Dubai. So it's a good evening from here. I'm happy to be here.
Varun.
Hi, I'm Varun Varma. I'm an ecologist, and I do research in ecosystems, ecology, global change, and food security. And I'm based in the UK. I work for Rothamsted Research, but I'm here in a personal capacity, so I'm not representing any organization.
Thank you. Varun, can you kick us off today, please, and talk a little bit about your experience around accessing content and perhaps provide some examples of where you've encountered issues during your career? I understand you've had some changes from one institution to the other and from one country to the other, and if you can share a little bit about that.
Sure. Changing institutions is a normal thing in academia, but so yes, I have moved countries. So I've been a researcher in India as well as in the UK. So I have dealt with academic publishing both as part of an institution in a developing economy as well as a developed economy. And to put it in a nutshell, access is a problem in both places, and it is a big problem. So just to give you an example, I started off like with my undergraduate and stuff in India, but then moved to the UK, did a second undergraduate, did a master's, worked as a research assistant. And that's when I kind of got into research, especially at the time as a research assistant. But then when I did my PhD, I moved back to India. And that was where I experienced the kind of first shock of access, because I was in basically a Russell's Group university in the UK, which had quite a comprehensive subscription to various journals. Access was not a problem per se. And then I moved to India, not to some small institution. It was, I would not say, quite easily amongst the top tiered institutions in India, which had, for Indian standards, a very good subscription to various journals. But the access compared to being in the UK was extremely limited. And that affected the way in which and the speed at which you could do your research. So for instance, the first part of my PhD work, you start putting together literature review towards some research questions you're developing, and something which would have taken about 2 to 3 weeks for that initial screen of literature, which you then kind of go into and deal with in more detail, became a slow and tedious process, which took months and months and months. And in fact, I still have drafts of that initial literature review, which have missing references in it because you wrote to authors. That's all you could do, right? You wrote to authors, you wrote to friends who were institutions who had access, and if they didn't get back to you, they didn't get back to you, and that's it. That was it, right? It's a function of where you are rather than what you know, right? And what you would like to know, and that affects the way in which you do research. So it slows down work. It makes your work incomplete. The second experience is this comes a lot from colleagues I have worked with. So a lot of work which is done, let's say, in ecology, climate change and stuff, things which are at the forefront of such research when it comes to human impacts or climate change impacts on humans. A lot of conservation ecology work is done by NGOs. NGOs do not have any money to support subscriptions, right? And this is where a majority of the work, good quality work, comes out from. Good quality students come out of these places. They have no access, and they depend, unfortunately, on a system like Sci-Hub. Without them, all these NGOs would not be able to do any work, right? Whether the publishing industry likes them or not, Sci-Hub is providing an invaluable service right now. Without them, all these NGOs would go under. This is not just India. This is in lots of developing countries, right? But this is not a problem just in developing countries. Even within the UK, for instance, if you're not in a top-tier university, you have limited access to information, right? You apply for a job, you take the job that you get. You can't sometimes choose the institution that you get a job. It's an extremely competitive place. You take what you get, but you can be limited by what access that institution has. Now, open access has helped this, but there's still a lot of problems with access. Journals have transitioned to open access, but what about their back catalog, right? Old science does not mean it's not important. Old science is really important. That's your background. How do you get access to that, right? So open access has helped with the newer stuff, but it also has just shifted the burden, right? And so even open access is not going to solve the problem. And we're going to get to it because we're talking about affordability later on. But yeah, access remains an issue, and always has been an issue. Yeah, that's my experience.
Thank you. That's probably a good place to hand it over to you, Cameron, to talk a little bit about your perspective on that and what Zendy's been trying to address, right?
Thanks very much, Romy, and thanks, Varun, for sharing those points. When you speak, it's just like every pain point that you're discussing is basically the driver of the start of Zendy. So when we're talking about access to information, as you mentioned rightly, like how do you get access? You need to be a researcher, an academic, or a student within a top university. Does that university have a subscription to all the content that is available out there? Yes or no? If you're in a different organization within the same country, do you have access? A lot of times, no, or you have very, very limited access. And if you move further around in some other countries, there's no access and there's no subscriptions, and you're basically left on your own. If we look at the whole publishing spectrum, at one side, you've got the paid content, which is behind a paywall, which we mentioned is not available, not affordable for all. Open access is there. The information is scattered. Each publisher has an element of open access. Some publishers are completely open access. And, but again, a lot of the open access policies is focusing on the newer content, as you mentioned. So moving forward, a lot of content is being published in open access. But when you look at the older content, it's not available. I was talking to one major publisher, and this was a year and a half ago, and still 95% of their content was behind paywall. 25% was OA content. So what solutions do individuals have? As you mentioned, illegal access is becoming more and more prominent, and there is a reason behind that. Not only just the discoverability access, it's the accessibility part as well. So you can find it, you can find the PDF, directly download the PDF. And as you mentioned, if you're doing a literature review, you need to go through hundreds of articles. And the pay-per-view method, like a $20, $30, $40 price per article, is not something sustainable when you're doing a literature review and you need to go through hundreds of articles and you're still not sure of what your access is. It really, really relevant until you fully read it. And another problem with the illegal content is, as you mentioned, the publishers are basically not seeing the results, the usage, the analytics behind it. It's a black hole of usage. It's good that it's applied in science, but the analytics plays a very important role for publishers as well into understanding what to publish, where to publish, what has been searched, all these elements. That's a valuable part of the whole scholarly process in order to make it better. So what did we come up with as a solution to this problem? Now, we've seen it happen in several other industries. Let's take the entertainment industry, music industry. How many are using Spotify within this group? How many have a subscription to Netflix? And the list goes on and on and on. The whole idea is that basically open access or traditional publishing, someone needs to pay for the process. There's a lot of value that is added in the publishing process. Now, working for a publisher and doing a dissertation on open access business models and really analyzing the whole workflow and the system, at the end of the day, there needs to be an income from somewhere, whether it's from the subscribers, whether it's an author pay, where the authors are paying, whether it's gold open access where someone's sponsoring the publishing process, someone needs to pay the bill. Now, what happens in a gig economy is that sort of financial element is spread among a wider community and making that accessibility element. So the prices come down, you get access to more content, and it's still affordable. So basically what we did is we came up with a model where you have unlimited access to all the content that is available. You pay a monthly subscription fee or an annual subscription, which is less than a price of a single article that you pay on a pay-per-view model. But at the same time, you get access to millions of articles. So you don't have to worry about not being able to access or having to go behind the paywalls. Of course, where we stand right now, there's a big journey ahead with more and more publishers coming on board and agreeing to more and more countries to be part of the process. But as a stepping stone, what we've done is we've created Zendy Open, a free global open access platform. It's available worldwide, and to any individual who wants to sign in. We're constantly enhancing the data and the experience and making the search better. And at the same time, in certain countries where we are getting the permissions from the publishers, we are launching an affordable way of access. This is currently available in 7 countries. These are not the countries with the highest levels of readership, but we needed to start somewhere to be able to basically build the confidence with publishers that you don't have to worry about the losing revenue. You really have to start looking at it as a means for more and more inclusion. More and more people, you've got alumni leaving university, you lose access. You're an independent researcher, you work for an NGO, you're an independent doctor, you're just interested in lifelong learning, right? You want evidence-based content to make your day-to-day decisions, whether it's a medication that someone's recommended, whether it's supplements, whether it's in health, whether it's in fitness, whether it's in management, marketing. It goes on and on and on. So the whole idea is to really democratize access to content, make it affordable. And so when researchers were doing valuable work like Varun in a country one day, when they want to have access, there is a solution. It's affordable, it's legal. Publishers get the information, the usage rightly. The content is on their platform. It's affordable, and the way the business model works is based on revenue sharing on the usage. So publishers get a revenue share similar to the music industry, or a royalty based on the usage of the content. So that's basically how it's been designed, and really what we're aiming for with Zendy. That's on the next slide. Our mission is really to enable, empower lifelong learning, for students, researchers, professionals within any industry. And the way that we're doing this is by addressing the affordability, accessibility, and discoverability issue. There's a long journey ahead. It's still not available in many, many countries. We've started the movement, right? So, the idea, the solution is there. It's not yet accessible in many, many countries, but we are working very hard towards adding more countries as we go, adding more publishers as we move along the way. And we really welcome publishers joining and experimenting with this new business model. It's worked in other industries, and it was a bold step for us to try and apply this on the academic literature and the scholarly communication side. So this is what we have come up with, and that's the direction that we're going. And of course, it really sits very well with the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically goal number 4 in inclusivity when it comes to access to education. So we really want to make a difference. We really want to make a change, and we really want to make content affordable and accessible to as many people as possible.
Cameron, can you talk a little bit about prices for individuals, like roughly cost variations or monthly access or yearly access, and also talk about capabilities for publishers on restricting content for different countries?
Absolutely. So the way that we looked at it was, so we're not going with the pricing that is available for Spotify, or we're not there yet. Maybe one day that could be possible, but we're really looking at the benchmark of the cost of a single article, which just varies from publisher to publisher, from $10 up to $35. And in some countries where really the income is low, they're going down as $10 per month for accessing the content. And for some other countries, it's up to like $20. But that's the average benchmark that we're looking in. And when it comes to yearly subscription, there's some relief or discounts on that front. Now, when it comes to countries, again, we're working very closely with publishers, and the publishers that we do have agreements with are based on a specific country. So we can really limit. So if, for example, Science Direct is available in one country, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's available in another country. It all depends on the licenses and the permissions from publishers. One important factor that I forgot to mention on the OA content is that we've, just to be on the safe side, and based on previous experience, we are able to filter out any CC BY NC content. It's open access, but if there's any hint of non-commercial, even though the Zendy open model is free and we're not commercializing, there's no subscription for that, and that's how it would remain. But still, we are following the license, and we're filtering out any CC BY NC content from there.
Thanks, Cameron. Varun, what are your thoughts? Do you think something like that would work for researchers in different regions?
Anything which brings about affordability is good. I need to understand the system a little bit better to be able to comment on it really well. But a couple of things based on the conversation that you just had was, this concept about restriction of access based on where you are, the point about the CC-BY, these are, in my opinion, and I do need to read into this a bit more, a little bit concerning. So, for instance, are you distributing CC-BY under a paid system?
No, it's not.
Right.
No.
Okay, so that is required clarifying. The next is if there is access. So as an academic, we use when we access a paper, right? You can look at an HTML, you can use a PDF, and so on. Each researcher uses it very differently. They'll put it into a reference manager. They'll, you'll mine the data. You want to access it offline, and so there are different ways in which different people use this, right? So if you're someone into natural language processing, you'll do something completely different. If you're a modeler like me, you'll do something completely different with it. Does it provide that, or is it just a read system, right? Because why I'm asking this is my last point when I was speaking was about journals which are transitioning to open access, but we don't have access to the back catalog. But I have found a couple of journals where they do provide just kind of a read-only kind of a system, which is great to skim, but it's not usable because I can't put that into my reference manager. I can't tag it. I can't annotate it. You can't use it the way you use that you would want to use a paper, right? So will this system actually restrict that, because you might be providing affordability but less usability? And my third point is, this is something which is not necessarily to do with what Zendy is trying to do, but I've come across this term that publishers provide value. But this is a term which I don't completely understand. It is too vague for me, right? And it will come to the affordability part of it as well. What is this value? Can publishers spell this out to the authors, please? I do not understand this at all, right? To me as an author, I'm giving you what I've created, right? I formatted it for you, right? You've got
some cases, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's been not one time where a figure, I have not had to edit a figure myself. There's been no input in terms of the way my visuals look. Yes, the paragraphing and so on is done by the journal according to your aesthetics, but that work's provided to you. It's peer reviewed. Yes, that is organized. Fine. That is a value. We get it peer reviewed internally as well, right, before we send it out for review, and it appears and it sits there, right? If you happen to have sent it to a big journal, maybe there's a press release which goes out. In most cases, nothing happens. It sits there waiting to be discovered. Yes, a search engine will troll through it. What is the value that is being spoken about over here? This extra value, which makes it cost so much. I don't understand it. And many researchers do not understand it because that is not communicated to us. Okay, so it would be great to know, like analytics, great. What does analytics do for a researcher, right? That's a publisher's point of view. Publisher wants to know that. So where's the value for the author for their bit of work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer that question. But if Vern's asking from a rhetorical perspective, then I don't want to. I can answer it or not answer it. I can certainly speak to how.
No, I'd love to know. It's an honest question.
Yeah, no, I know. And I totally agree that publishers are not great about explaining this. And when you couple that with, saying that an APC to publish is $9,000, or saying that a subscription to read is, $100,000, it's a very, very hard case to make. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of an open science publisher, right? An open access publisher, no subscription base. But whether or not you're there's some basic things that we do. So a huge cost to the work we do is the technical infrastructure. I think we're probably of the age that we can all remember when we sent physical papers around for peer review and how much fun that was. But now that has all been replaced by extremely expensive IT infrastructure that requires developers, that requires servers, that requires huge, 6-7 figure contracts with providers to enable what is not a fun submission process. Like having submitted to journals myself, it's not fun, but the digitizing of all of that process is incredibly expensive. And it's amazing how people are unaware of that. I spend all day talking to librarians, and when I tell them, let me tell you roughly how much we spend on our submission system, their eyes kind of pop out of their heads. But that's what that technology costs. The other big thing that publishers spend a lot of time on and a lot of money on is the massive network. In the case of PLOS, tens of thousands of editors and peer reviewers who, yes, are not paid for their work, but who are vital to ensuring that the communities that we serve get their papers through, in a timely manner. And sometimes that is really smooth and easy, and sometimes it's not. But I think the number, when I was asked many, many moons ago by a rather angry librarian, what is it publishers do that, a library can't do or somebody else can't do? And I said, honestly, we have the relationships with thousands of communities in various subject areas of people who are then we're able to marshal to engage in that peer review process. And can that be done by an individual researcher within their community? That absolutely can. Can that be done to scale? That's something that's hard to do effectively. And publishers, I think, for the most part, are quite effective at doing that. And the cost of doing that, that takes people, that takes technology, that takes time. The other big piece, and Varun, I would agree, this is very hidden from authors, is when we moved from print to digital publishing, we also took on a huge IT infrastructure cost to do that, right? So whether or not you like the publisher websites with all their bells and whistles, the process of taking print production and putting it online and making that content available online with all of the bells and whistles publishers have is extremely expensive. Again, a limited number of providers doing that work, and increasingly more coming on the scene that are providing those services at a reduced rate. But in the case of PLOS, we publish something like 20,000 papers a year. Not just anybody can take that on. That's a really high volume of papers, and you need a technology partner that can service that. And then the last piece, which is a very big priority to institutions, is what the publishers invest in to make the content discoverable. So it really isn't just publishing it on the site and then hoping Google crawls it. There's actually a ton of technical infrastructure that's built to push that research out to various places, often at the demands of the library. And this is a place where libraries, I think, deserve a lot of credit for expecting publishers to provide that kind of infrastructure. The discoverability part is a really key part of that. And that's kind of blew my mind as I've dived more into it, how much money and time is spent on that, particularly when the content is closed. It's much less needed when the content is open because of all of the benefits we've talked about. So PLOS doesn't do as much of this as a closed publisher does. But when the content is closed, you need to put it in as many places as possible because people are going to keep hitting paywalls and need to find other ways in. And then I'd say the last piece is, and certainly these are with large publishers, that have the scale. So PLOS is one of them. We spend a ton of money taking your article and making sure lots of people see it. Especially because the papers are open. We want to make sure that all the folks that have to use Zendy don't have to when they're a teacher, a practitioner, a legislator. My husband spends all day, he's a teacher, bumping into paywalls around pedagogical research, right? Because all of that is closed. So the marketing, quite frankly, that publishers do via social media, via author engagement, via news and press releases, and that is actually something PLOS spends a lot of time on, is press releases, is critical to getting those alternative metrics. So it impacts your citations, certainly, and your downloads, but it also impacts engagement kind of in other places. So that's a very high level list, but I'd say does that justify a $9,000 APC? No, it doesn't. And the difference between how the closed publishers and the sort of legacy approach versus what publishers like PLOS has to do is when you make everything open and you work in a paradigm of trying to be as transparent as you can, suddenly those 30% margins get very hard to keep. And so when we get into my slides, one of the things that I talk about is there's a real calculus publishers have to do around revenue maximization, whether that's your priority, versus cost recovery and sustainable revenue growth that keeps the business healthy, but isn't bringing in those super, super high margins. And that's something I think a lot of publishers are struggling with, not because they're, all of them anyway, are super greedy, but because in a lot of cases, you know, a 30% margin is fueling all of the work a society does to support their members, right? In a lot of cases, for example, for learned societies, publishing funds all the things they do for their members. And so if you suddenly tell them, that's great, now you're going to slip to open access and your margin is going to be 5%. There's real like, oh my God, how do we keep funding what we do? So there's a real challenge for the ones that have to split. But from the perspective of a publisher that's already open, there's kind of a resignation that our margins are going to be smaller, so we can make ideally our APCs more affordable. I would argue even $1,000 APC is not affordable. So that's something we have to deal with. And increasingly, we just need to do models that don't rely on APC. So that's my stab, Varun, at answering your question. I don't know if it's satisfying or not, but
thanks, Sarah.
that's
Cameron answered a question as well about what you can do with the content on Zendy.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely that there was an angle that I wanted to add, as there was a part of the question that was addressing the affordability, but not accessibility. But just to echo what Sarah mentioned, like we've developed a search engine for Zendy in-house. 2.5 years of development work have gone into that, and there's still so much. Like when we're talking about big data, AI tools, there's so endless possibilities, and there's so much work that could go into it. And when we talk about analytics, just one thing that I want to share from a publisher's angle is, and that's some of the data that in some cases, some researchers actually request, and the publishers are able, because of that analytics part, and that's discovering trends, readership, with regards to cutting edge technology, especially in biomedicine and those fields. There's so much value in the analytics that I once heard a comment that the analytics are actually the bigger revenue generator than the subscription, especially in the future. So analytics is no small part at all. But back to Zendy, that's
a whole nother webinar. Totally agree.
Absolutely. So just back to Zendy and the limitations. I 100% agree with you, Varun. There's been some attempts like to make things affordable, but limitations. You can only download 10 pages. You can only read one chapter. You can only see it, but you can't download it. And basically at the forefront of Zendy is unlimited. You can search as much as you want. You can download as much as you want. You can save it. You can read as much as you want. So when a publisher is ready to accept this type of access, then that's when the onboarding happens. But otherwise, if there's going to be a limitation in the access, that will just then we haven't served the purpose of Zendy. So that's our aim, that's our goal. We still don't have. There's a long journey to go. Many countries we don't have the license. We don't have access to the content of many publishers. But it's moving forward. We've got, like, out of the 5 big publishers, we've already got agreements with 3. So we're actually experimenting with 3 of these in some of the countries. So as I said, it's a movement. We're not there yet, but that not having limitations, unlimited access is that goal. And for the open access content part, as I mentioned, that's free. So on the platform, you'll have an option to continue to have access to open access content for free. But if you want to reach the paywall content, then it can become available at an affordable cost, not at a single price per article, and then you have to move on to the next article or you can't find it. So I hope that covers the questions.
Thanks, Cameron. I think we'll try and move on and speak a little bit about, and we've touched on that already, affordability when it comes to open access publishing. Varun, do you have any experiences that you want to share in terms of funding versus no funding, APC payments, and so on?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think open access has been great for the end consumer as an academic or a non-academic. I think in both cases, it's been really good. But the APC system is just something which is bonkers. I mean, 9,000 value has already been said. I don't even know where to begin with that one. So let's go slightly lower. Now, I work in the field of ecology, and on an average, the kind of journal that I would publish in, or I have published in with open access, it's about 2,200 to 2,500 pounds per article. This is not, we're not stratifying this by, is this a very high level journal or a mid-tier or I mean, even niche journals to mid-tier journals. Yeah, we're talking about 2,200 to 2,500, right? Now I'm going to take this as an example from experiences that I've had in India and people who do work there in ecology. Right. So India, till very recently, I think most of the time you ask for a waiver, you would get a waiver. That's becoming less certain, for sure. Okay. So let me put that money into context. In the place I did my PhD, when you applied for a largish grant, that would work out to something like 50,000 to 60,000 pounds for a 3-year, 4-year project, right? Everything included: PhD student wages, research assistant wages, consumables, travel, equipment, what have you. A good project, you would want to deliver 3 papers. Yeah, that'll be considered good. That's 15 touching 20% of your project budget, right? So fine. I mean, Sarah said that there are costs to publishing, but then the researcher can ask, where do I get my value? Do I get my value in hiring a research assistant, skilled person for an entire year for the cost of 1 article, generate 500,000 extra data points? Should I put that into publishing an article, which, if it's a niche article, yes, in a 10-year period, maybe 100 people, 200 people will read it in detail. 50 people might cite it. You've made an achievement, but then the researcher starts making a value judgment, right? Is that worth it? Do I generate more information and more facts about things? And it becomes quite a hard decision to make, right? When 15 to 20% of your project budget could potentially go into publishing. Now it comes to the waivers thing, right? Yes, places like India, you did get waivers most of the time, almost all the time. You don't get it as certain now. But the thing is, every time you submit an article, you either put it in your covering letter, you tick a box. It's a bit demoralizing. It's like asking for a handout every single time. Every single time. It's not a nice feeling. Plus, it adds another bit of uncertainty to an already very uncertain process. Right? Are you going to then be rejected because you can't afford it? Right? The information that you generated that doesn't have a value by itself because you can't afford to put it out. There's something morally wrong about that. Right? And yeah, that's. Let's not even get into the 9,000 one. I thought I would mention it, but and this is where I will look into the links which Sarah has sent around about the value. But it is something I've spoken to a number of people who are non-academics, and I try to explain to them how the academic system works. Right? Most people will look at me in absolute disbelief, saying, "You did a PhD. I thought you were clever. How can you fall for this?" Right? There are some people who have laughed at me, and I'm essentially an inside joke. Right? It is just completely incomprehensible that, and I'm not saying that, okay, pay the researchers or pay the peer reviews. No, that's not what I'm saying. But just the entire model seems completely insane to anybody outside academia, because it is insane. Right? Yeah, that's the thing with affordability, I think.
Let's hand it over to Sarah and respond to that.
Yeah, I'll pick up on some of that and definitely want to echo all of that, because it's bananas. And I actually just put a link to a very interesting documentary that dives into this. So if you feel like examining a little bit more the economics of publishing, which are insane. That's a very interesting documentary to take a look at. So yeah, I'm the director of strategic partnerships at PLOS. I joined in 2019 specifically to address this problem. We knew we had a problem with APCs. We were one of the first publishers to use them. We had a lot of success with them because publishers saw, wow, you can make a lot of money with APCs. All of the publishers really in the space jumped on this bandwagon, which is why we have a huge universe of hybrid journals that charge both for subscriptions and for open access. And we realized we had both an equity problem and a long-term sustainability problem, knowing that APCs really should not be the final step in business models in an open access world. So I'll just talk a little bit about what we're talking about. So in the next slide, I like to briefly define equity because we talk about equity a lot. And there's a very useful visual I like to provide that I think helps with this. So if you take a look at the next slide, this is the classic representation that is done. Sometimes it's a baseball game, sometimes it's a different kind of event, but it's this idea that the definition of equality is you treat everyone the same, but you don't take into account circumstances. Equity looks at circumstances, whatever they may be. And so if you click through the little things that pop up on this screen, if you imagine the game is, every aspect of the scientific knowledge creation and dissemination process. You see the gentleman on the left who's tallest as kind of your standard well-funded English-speaking global North researcher at a well-resourced institution. And then you see, depending on the folks in other circumstances, many of which are not in their control, suddenly just having the little box to stand on makes very little difference in terms of actually affecting change. When you're talking about equity, you're talking about systemic change. You're taking into account the fact that not everyone is starting in the same place, and therefore the way we address barriers to participation has to change over time. So this is a very basic way of explaining this difference, but I think it's critical when you start to look at very complicated issues like how to make publishing affordable. Next slide, please. So in the context of open access and OA, everything Varun stated is very well documented in peer review papers. So this particular paper quotes another article from iOS Press, if you want to click through, Romy, that really speaks to the challenges that authors face. It's just deeply an exclusive model. If you don't have the money to participate in this kind of model, you're never going to it's not magically going to appear. And the way publishers have built in equity through waivers does not address the problem for all the reasons that Varun mentioned. Next slide, please. So really, if we're going to think beyond APCs, and that's a big if, right? Because if publishers and funders continue to take kind of the 2018 view that, just go gold, go move, the point is make everything open to read, like that's the priority. We're very possibly going to get stuck in a world in which the predominant model is that authors pay. And that cannot be the end point. It might be one model, but it needs to be part of a mixed economy. And to do that, publishers have to balance some really difficult questions, legitimately difficult questions. So, margins are going to be a lot smaller in this kind of a world. Cost recovery as opposed to revenue maximization is really going to be a priority. Thinking about affordability regionally, thinking about what to do about institutions that previously only paid to read because they don't publish, what's going to happen to their money and what happens if it leaves the system. And then how do we make the entire author experience equity focused from the moment you submit to the moment you're accepted and pay or don't pay or have your fees covered by someone else. So there's work, and I will say, just to Varun's point, all of the things on the screen, doing all of these from a publisher perspective, very expensive. All of these are very expensive to do, but they need to be done. So how are we doing that? So at PLOS, we have a number of models, and sorry, this is very text heavy, so I'll just talk through it. We have a number of models that are trying to address those things in different ways. The first model, Community Action Publishing, or CAP, specifically addresses the $9,000 APC problem, right? And that's this idea that, hey, if you want to publish in a highly selective journal that rejects 80 to 90% of the papers that come in, that's really expensive. And the only way to make that open is to charge $9,000, $10,000, whatever some of these crazy APCs are. We at PLOS were like, fundamentally, that cannot be true. Like, we reject that as a premise. We think there's another way. And so we came up with this collective action model that shifts costs from the authors to their institutions in the form of an annual fee. Institution pays an annual fee. Authors publish as much as they want with no fee. And if you belong to an institution that doesn't join, there's quite a high non-member fee, and that's intentional. We want institutions to join. So in many cases, the non-member fee for one paper is more than if the institution paid an annual fee. So we're intentionally trying to drive people to the model. And we're really public about the revenue target. We say how much money we need to make. We say how much margin that we need to have to run the journals. And in this case, we've gone with a 10% margin. And once we hit that number, we're going to redistribute any overages beyond that number back to all the institutions that participated. So this is one attempt to address the question of highly selective publishing, but also to address the regional disparities in economics, as well as to ensure that more institutions can participate. And we do that by counting both corresponding and contributing author activity. We don't just count corresponding author activity. And that, from a publishing, from an author perspective, that's like, who cares? That's a trivial thing. From a publishing perspective, though, it dramatically changes the landscape of potential institutions that can participate, which is really important. There's a lot of institutions out there that do not very much often publish as the corresponding author, but they're often contributing authors. And if you don't count that behavior, you're actually letting a lot of institutions publish without paying their fair share. So that component sounds small. It's actually a huge lift to do it, but critical to building equity. The global equity model is a little different. With this model, we were trying to address the question of how do you take new journals with no publishing history, and convince an institution like Harvard to participate, but also convince one of the IITs in India to participate. Different circumstances geographically, different likelihood of publishing. And so we came up with a fee structure where the most you'll ever pay for 1 year of unlimited publishing is $6,000. The least you'd pay is $1,000, but that shifts up or down depending on your World Bank lending classification, high income, upper middle income, or lower middle income. And so on the lower middle income side, you might pay only $200 or $300 annually for unlimited publishing. On the high income, Harvard would never pay more than $6,000 annually. So trying to get to a number that works on both ends of the spectrum for something that's brand new and has no history. And again, using the corresponding and contributing author counts to determine publishing activity, as well as making sure anyone from a Research for Life country can publish at no cost. The last thing I'll say, because I know I'm going over.
Sarah, is this a cost to the author or to the institution?
No, it's to the institution. That's to the institution. We figure out what the institution pays based on how often they're affiliated both with a corresponding author and with contributing authors. And that is a very complicated thing to do, but that's important. So no cost to the authors for that. And then the last piece on top of
So on the institutional, is any previous history of publishing from that institution taken into consideration, or is regardless of how much?
Yeah, that's how you end up in a tier. That's how you get put into a tier. And then the last piece on top of all of this, as Varun mentioned, was the experience from the author side. If you're going to keep using waivers, you need to have it happen in a way that doesn't put any burden on the author, as little burden as the author as possible. But ideally, submissions and payment systems and the final place that it's published use things like persistent identifiers and technical tech partnerships to reduce the burden on the author. So you can just get in, do your submission, hopefully get accepted, and move on. That's me.
So ask one thing about this.
Yeah.
When you're saying institutions, you're talking about research institutions.
In most cases.
What about people? What about NGOs? What about independent researchers?
In the case of NGOs and independent researchers, so independent researchers, if they want to publish, they are actually a perfect case of where waivers actually make sense in a lot of cases. There's not that population is relatively small. The case for supporting it is kind of a no-brainer. That's typically what we would do for those. For NGOs and stuff, though, they can either participate in these models, but in a lot of cases, most of the time, they are automatically participating through their Research for Life affiliation, depending on where they're based. So if you're an NGO, that's based out of, Southern Africa, that's probably covered through Research for Life, and you just submit with no cost.
Right. Because I just want to make actually one point, which a colleague of mine had told me about regarding the APCs and people who work for NGOs, is that a lot of money for NGOs actually comes from things like corporate social responsibility funds, where the corporate partner does not actually care about publishing. So you can't actually pull money for publishing from the person funding the research. And so the whole system falls down in terms of somebody trying to build up a academic repertoire, but don't have the money to actually publish. Just sort of made that point.
Yeah, I think one of the key sort of next steps, just to get to your slide, Romy, about what comes next. One of the big things we're trying to figure out at PLOS is how we move beyond research organizations. I would argue funders need to contribute directly to these models, not just research organizations. There's a real challenge with finding a way for funders to participate to make this easier for the people that they fund. Certainly in the context of NGOs, nonprofits, corporate social responsibility, that's another one we're trying to figure out is, can we partner with those organizations at the corporate level to eliminate some of these challenges? And of course, once you do that, you get challenges with conflict of interest and other things like that. So there's a lot of nuance to unpack there, but government agencies, NGOs, funders, these are all places that we are engaged with to try to figure out how can you support this work, because it's in your interest to do so. So that's kind of a next step for us.
Yeah. Also want to pick on something Varun said earlier in terms of having to request for the waiver. And Sarah, you talked about workflow and infrastructure. And I think that's a really important piece. One thing is changing policies and making all these changes about the system, but the other one is about the kind of, how you're going to charge. But the other thing is the workflow, making sure it actually happens. And then what I visualize is that the experience should be so smooth for authors that they are automatically recognized. So there shouldn't be a need to ask for a waiver, but it should, like in your case, Sarah, automatically apply a certain price if they come from a certain author, an institution that they're affiliated with. So it shouldn't be this kind of, I'm asking for a waiver, I'm asking for a discount, but it's just a certain price that they see, right?
Exactly.
And Varun, have you had experiences where these things are in place, where you've had smoother acceptance, smoother submission, or is it still really difficult in terms of having to request waivers at the moment?
You still have to request. One of the more annoying things about the APC, when you do say, okay, even if you want to pay, right, is finding that information. So you go to a journal's website and the information, if it's an open access publisher, it should be right there in the front next to the submit manuscript button. But usually it's, 2 or 3 clicks away, which is not, whatever little trust is there is broken right there, because you need to dig for that information. Right. In fact, there's a couple of journals where you'll click, and you'll come and you'll have to download an Excel spreadsheet or something which has a listing of all the journals that the publisher offers. Then you do Control F, find the journal name, and then oh, right, can't afford that. Move on. So yeah, that's it's this added.
That's for the waiver process, or just to find out the APC?
No, I'm talking about both. And so one is you still have to ask for the waiver, but when I say you're actually looking for, okay, how much is the APC? It's not actually right there in front of you when
that's unacceptable. Yeah, that's unacceptable.
It just comes across as
incredibly lazy.
Transparent.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Let's not forget that given the whole shift in the business models has opened up the playing field for some opportunistic behavior as well. And we see this with, for example, predatory publishers. We've heard of predatory conferences. There's a lot of awareness that is going against these movements. But again, for an early career researcher who's just starting to publish, navigating all of this, it becomes overwhelming. So in general, that knowledge, and that's a requirement itself, the training, the skills that an early career researcher needs to navigate in order to get onto that publishing ladder or tenure, it's just like unbelievable.
It is. And that's the fence, right? That's the fence that is preventing people from joining the game. I think that kind of thing.
The predatory publishing thing is a big issue, and to an extent, given how things are priced, are we really surprised that predatory publishing exists? To the extent the same people who made fun of me about this before have said that, I mean, how's the average publisher who you consider non-predatory actually? I mean, why aren't they considered predatory, right? I've had comments for that as well. Then yes, it is. Which journals are predatory, which are not? Not an easy thing to do. They're apparently, I've not looked into this, but there's apparently a service that a library can subscribe to. I'm not sure if this exists anymore or not, but you have to subscribe to it to get a list of journals which are predatory or not, blacklists and whitelists. So that itself is behind a paywall.
That's very good. Yeah, I think there's a lot of room there's initiatives like Think, Check, Submit against predatory publishing. I think the awareness is the most important tool. And then for predatory conferences, this is actually an initiative that we've created to educate researchers, and it's called Think, Check, Attend. So it's basically a list of questions that you are able to ask to be able to identify if a conference is predatory or not. But in general, from what I've seen in terms of the pain points, and this is what I've learned from working on the publishing side and going through all these different years of working on the different fronts, is there's no 0 and 1 answer in this business model. And for example, as what you mentioned, there's room for a lot of experiments. At PLOS, you've got your different models to experiment and to try and to really level out the playing field. And for us, one of the ways in order to tackle the accessibility and affordable issue, because the way the pace things are moving, like what is happening in the OA world right now, basically was the conclusion of a dissertation that I wrote nearly 16, 17 years ago, and nothing has changed from those predictions. So it's basically, you just have to have the vision, the understanding to be able to look at this challenge from a different perspective and come up with solutions. And some of these might work and some of them might not work, but Zendy is our attempt to try and solve the global affordability and accessibility issue.
Yeah, and I would say in terms of what's next, Sarah, maybe you agree. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of discussion around this issue of inequity around APCs and coming up with different models, and in a way, read and publish agreements for the non-OA publishers is a way around the APC charge to the author to make things easier. And also a lot of publishers I know looking at workflow solution to make the whole process easier for authors going through that system. Is there anything else you want to add before we close up in terms of what's next, the next steps, really briefly?
I've just shared a couple of links that might be useful as resources, and hope folks will share them broadly.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Any final words, Cameron, Varun?
No, just thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss. And it's great to hear the pain points from Varun and some of the solutions on the OA front from Sarah. We're all working collectively to be able to find solutions. And the aim at the end of the day is the same. It's like that accessibility needs to be there, and paving the ways for publishing is another angle of it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Anyone else has listened or joined in, please sign up for the Kronos Hub newsletter, and on the website you can get an overview of our upcoming webinars. Next week, actually, we've got our next webinar, open access and authorship data, and how open access has made publishers and libraries look at open access at their authorship data differently. And Sarah talked a little bit about this in terms of corresponding author and co-author, and suddenly the corresponding author has become a lot more important than it was originally intended to be. So have a discussion about that next week if you want to join us for that. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, and thank you, the three of you, for joining me today in this panel.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.